This here is the Sony ZV E10 II, and it's a fantastic little camera. It's got an APS-C size sensor, and in fact it's the same sensor fitting in the cinema line FX30 and also the A6700, which I also own. I use that one mainly for photography, and then this one I use for my video work. So I've now got an APS-C camera for both video and photography, because for me, I just like the smaller compact size of them and smaller lenses you can get for them, and also just how much cheaper all the kit is. Like the lenses come in mainly half the price of full frame cameras. But first of all, let's take a look at some of the footage I shot with this camera around this beautiful little cottage, and then I'll run through some of those specs with you and say why I just think it's a great option for shooting your real estate video with. Well, I'm sure you'd agree, these shots with this camera look great. I mean, the detail on them, the sharpness looks brilliant, and the colors are great. And this really is a big step up from its predecessor, the Sony ZV E10. The main reason why is the color space, because it now has the 10-bit 422 color. And that's a big step up from the 8-bit color, which the ZV E10 II, which means you can now shoot in S-Log3 and really push those colors and just get the best looking image you can. Because before, with the ZV E10, you could shoot in S-Log2, but S-Log3 rather, but it just didn't look as good when you went to color grade it, because it just didn't handle those sort of dark areas and the colors as well as this does now with that upgraded color science. So as well as that upgraded color science, the other benefit of this camera over its predecessor is that it now shoots 4K footage up to 60 frames per second. And that's absolutely perfect really for shooting real estate. I mean, here in the UK, I obviously shoot 50 frames per second because of how it interacts with the lighting, so you don't get all the humming in the lighting. But that means you can just slow it down, and find 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second to slow it down is absolutely fine. So you can get that smooth footage as you glide through the property, and then you can speed it up however you like. So that just works absolutely great for shooting real estate. As I've just mentioned, this does shoot in S-Log3, and the other great thing about this is you can import LUTs onto this. So you can have the LUT that you're going to have the final look of just like baked into the image already. Not something I've done just yet, but I do intend to do it because I do use the phantom LUTs when I'm color grading, and specifically the sort of RE camera cinema look. So if you haven't checked those out, do check out the phantom LUTs because they do look great with the S-Log3 footage. And as well as the S-Log3 color profile, it's obviously got the S Cinetone, which I do use a lot also, especially when I'm shooting stuff with clients, when I've got people in it, just because the skin tones look great and you don't really have to do much color grading with it. So the S Cinetone color profile really is a great option on these Sony cameras now. I just mentioned that it does shoot up to 60 frames per second at 4K, but there is a slight crop, like it's only a 1.1 crop, so it's not really that noticeable, but you get no crop factor up to 30 frames per second. So I guess if anything, that might be a slight drawback, that you do get that bit of a crop, but honestly, I shoot with a pretty wide lens. I've got here the Artisan 10mm lens, so it's an equivalent of 15mm full frame. So that little crop really doesn't really matter too much, because I'm still getting a wide enough field of view when I'm shooting all these rooms, when I'm shooting real estate. If you want to shoot 120 frames per second, well, you are limited just to 1080p with that, so you're not going to get 4K footage. But for me, shooting real estate, I'm never really going to shoot 120 frames per second, because I just do think that's a bit overkill. So up to 60 frames per second, 4K, absolutely fine for me. I guess we've got to look at some of the drawbacks of this camera, because obviously this is a bit of a budget option. I mean, it comes in at a credible price of about £1,000 here in the UK, which is obviously one of the mega plus points, and partly why I got it as well, like I say, because you can get the cheaper lenses for it too. So this whole setup, in actual fact, only cost me about £1,200, because this lens here only costs about £150 too. So it's an incredibly good value setup. But let's get back to talking about those drawbacks, and that is there can be a bit of an overheating issue with this if you're shooting long periods of time. But for me, shooting real estate, I'm only ever really shooting bits that are only about maybe 10 to 30 seconds max. So I never really get that overheating issue. Maybe if I'm using it to record myself, like videos like this, I may run into that problem, but so far, I've never had a problem at all. There's also no IBIS in this camera, which could be a bit of an issue, but again, I'm always using it with a gimbal if I'm shooting video with it. So it's not really an issue for me, but if you are planning on shooting handheld, doing a bit more vlogging perhaps, then you might have a bit of an issue. But as long as you get lenses with the optical stabilization in, easy for you to say, then you should be all right. So just keep that in mind if you are going to use this camera for a bit of vlogging too. But like I say, I'm always on a gimbal, so not really a deal breaker for me either. Obviously, because this is an APS-C sensor and not full frame, it does suffer a bit with that rolling shutter. So if you're sort of panning left and right a lot, then you will get those sort of wobbly lines a bit. But again, for me, I don't really do many panning shots. I'm just usually sort of going forward, gliding through. So not really an issue for me again. So as you can see a pattern here, this is why I like it. All these drawbacks aren't really an issue for me, but I just thought you better know them just whilst you make your decision, as it could be a deal breaker for you. The last sort of downside with this camera is it only has one SD card slot. So if you do want the security of having that second slot just to back the footage up, then this might not be for you. But to be honest, I'm willing to take the risk. I've never really had any issues with any of my SD cards failing. Just got to make sure you look after them, because usually the problem happens if it's out of camera and you just not looked after the memory card, I find. But fingers crossed, so far so good. So I guess one of the other big questions you might want to ask yourself is, do you get the ZV E10 or the ZV E1? Because that's obviously the full frame equivalent of this camera, and obviously it's going to retail for a bit more because it is that full frame sensor. But one of the main difference is that you're going to get better low light performance. But to be honest, I've not noticed a huge amount of difference between this and the ZV E1, because I have shot with them both. I used to own the ZV E1 before I got this, and then found, well, there wasn't a great amount of difference in it. Because with the ZV E1, you get 15 stops dynamic range, and this you get 14 stops dynamic range. So not a huge amount of difference, but you might get better quality, obviously, in the blacks than you do with the ZV E1 than you do to this camera. So that's one of the big differences, obviously, having that full frame sensor. You're going to get better low light performance. Another benefit of the ZV E1 is you get 4K 120 frames per second. So like I mentioned, you can't get it on this. But for me, as I already said, I don't really care for having 120 frames per second at 4K, because I'm just never really going to use it. But if you think you do need 120 frames per second a lot, then go for the ZV E1, because you're going to get better quality imagery at that higher frame rate.
Just after I started shooting this video, I visited a property which was very dark and moody inside. It was an old cottage, so there was lots of like dark wooden floors and beams, and it was bright outside, so it was quite a tricky scenario to shoot in. But the Sony ZV E10 II handled this really well, so I just wanted to share the footage with you of this property. So let's take a look. So what do you think? Please leave your comments below what you thought of that footage, but I felt it handled it really well. But let's get back on with the rest of the video and I'll tell you my final thoughts about this camera.
The ZV E10 also benefits with that full frame in that you don't get the rolling shutter that you do in the ZV E10 too. But after considering all those sort of downsides to this camera compared to the ZV E10, you've also got to take into consideration the price point, as this does retail for about £1,000, whereas the ZV E10 is more like £2,000 or maybe about £1,800 if you shop around, so it's nearly double the price. And then you've got to take into consideration how much the lenses are. Obviously full frame lenses cost more compared to the APS-C size lenses. So personally for me, I just love using this camera because of the size, form factor. It's got great sharpness, detail, does work great in low light, and then just the whole setup's a lot cheaper. So if that sounds good for you, then I'd go for this. But obviously, if you still fancy the ZV E10, I've done another review of that here, so check that one out too. But thanks for watching, guys, and enjoy your video shooting.